We're pleased to see you, of course, and to say that the very purpose of the Institute, which is a means of focusing the wide international interests of a dozen or more departments in this university, is to enable gatherings of this kind to take place. We're not only here to teach our own MA students and other people who are here for quite precise purposes, but we are here to enable the, I hope, rational, calm, sensible, friendly, good-humoured discussion, even of the most contentious issues, like many of those which you have to confront today. And we should like, you would like, I'm sure, to thank Dr. Stavridis for the immense effort which he has put into the organisation of the whole enterprise, which has called for a great deal of devotion, I think, well beyond the normal hours and calls of duty. We should also like to thank, and perhaps you or I or both of us could write on behalf of today's gathering, to the Bank of Cyprus and to the Juventus Foundation for the grants which have made it possible to hold the conference. And in these days when universities have to search around earnestly, at least for modest sources of outside funding, to enable very useful and necessary gatherings like this to take place, it's the more agreeable to find that it isn't an impossible thing to do if you search with enough vigour. And with that, may I ask Dr. Stavridis to address us. He's going to speak about the not small set of issues embraced in the title, What is the Cyprus Problem? To whom does it matter and why? And he has perhaps a quarter of an hour in which to answer these attractive questions which he's posed himself.
Especially as I feel I deserve them fully. Because I deserve the congratulations because indeed I have had a very good idea. Like the story with Columbus's egg, which, no? The story? Columbus was asked, can you make an egg stand on its head or something like that? He said, or perhaps he posed the question to someone. Nobody could make the egg stand on its head. And he broke the egg slightly to make it stand. So once somebody shows you a way, then it becomes very easy to repeat it. Now, I said that I had a very good idea, and the idea was to invite you here. To invite people, Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots, Greek people, Turkish people, British and other people who have taken an interest in the Cyprus problem, to come together here, since they cannot meet in the country whose problem they are discussing, to discuss that problem. It seems to be part of the Cyprus problem, or it enters into the character of the Cyprus problem, that Cypriots themselves cannot discuss it, and therefore they cannot get to understand each other's point of view in Cyprus itself. And they have to travel a long way before they can be together and tell each other what it is that concerns them, tell each other what it is that they find personally or as a community very important about the Cyprus problem, and ask what perhaps the other side might feel concerned about in relation to the Cyprus problem. The Cypriot is a little quotation I always like to use in any talk in order to get perhaps an early laugh. The Cypriots, wrote the humorist 25 long years ago, know that they cannot become a great power, a world power, but they have become a world nuisance, which is almost as good. Now, since George Mikesh wrote this little witticism in 1965, a lot of things happen in the world, but it seems not in Cyprus. Since the Cyprus problem is still being discussed intensely by people who have very, very strong views about it, and since 1974, when 1/3 of the country is under the control of troops from Turkey, which any Greek Cypriot, including itself would call it an occupation by a foreign power, but I can see that Turkish Cypriots may take a different view here, or many of them. Since 1974, the Cyprus problem acquired a quasi-military character in a way. It involves certainly the presence of troops, and therefore the presence of hostile troops, and therefore the potential for conflict. Now, in the last few months, the Cyprus problem has become, I won't say top priority for the great powers in the world, but certainly more important, and there are efforts afoot to see whether a solution can be reached. And I think that it's very fitting that people should look at the problem. Greek and Turkish Cyprus primarily, but everybody else is also interested in the problem. But of course, the problem existed well before 1974. Indeed, it did exist when, for example, I was born. I was born 46 years ago, middle-aged man. But late youth, let's say. Late youth. And one of my earliest memories were demonstrations. And a lot of talk about the Cyprus problem. I didn't know that I was the purpose of the demonstration, except that I did have some idea that people were calling for Enosis, the union of Cyprus with Greece. But I didn't know at the time also that the Turkish Cypriots were organizing counter demonstrations, perhaps at a smaller level, but enough Turkish Cypriots felt very strongly in the late 40s to oppose very vehemently any suggestion that Cyprus could be united to Greece, even though 80% of the population of Cyprus were people of Greek descent, or Greek origin, or Greeks, for that's how they saw themselves. And of course, the Cyprus problem didn't just arise in 1945. My father was born in 1912, and he himself remembers the Cyprus problem as a very small boy. He remembers talking about from Greek Cyprus wanting to unite the island with Greece. It was, of course, until 1960 a British colony, and at that time, Turkish Cypriots perhaps were not able to demonstrate, but there were enough Turkish Cypriots to argue that Cyprus should not be given to Greece by Britain, but should Britain decide to leave, then in accordance with the convention under which Cyprus was handed in 1878 by the Ottoman, by the Sublime Court, by the Sultan to the British, should be reverted to, should revert back to Ottoman sovereignty. And certainly the Cyprus problem did not begin in 1912, because when my grandfather was born, and he was the oldest man I ever met, there was still a Cyprus problem. When the British came to Cyprus in 1878, it's in all history books, the representative of the Greek Cypriots, in some books is supposed to be the Archbishop, in other books is the Bishop of Kythia, welcomed the first British High Commissioner, saying to him that we welcome the change of administration in Cyprus, because we are hoping that Cyprus will be given by the British to Greece as it had done in 1864 in the case of the Ionian Islands. What the books don't say, or not many books say, is that a day or two later, when the High Commissioner visited Ottoman officials and Ottoman members of the Ottoman elite, they themselves declared their loyalty to the British Crown, but they said that, you know, they certainly don't want Greece to, Cyprus to be united to Greece. So the point of these quasi-autobiographical remarks is to show that there was never a time in living memory when there was no Cyprus problem, and nobody knew anybody else in Cyprus, nobody knows anybody else in Cyprus who ever remember a time when there wasn't a Cyprus problem to be talked about at first, in the end of the 19th century, by a small Greek Cypriot elite, which demanded union of Cyprus with Greece, and it was opposed by the Ottoman elite. In the next generation, the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot elites were able to raise their children in the belief that something very, very important was at stake, namely the rights of the community, and the new generation was brought up to believe that they might have to fight and struggle, in the case of the Greek Cypriots, to unite Cyprus with Greece, in the case of the Turkish Cypriots, to oppose that. And that larger group brought up the new generation, the generation of my age, to believe that really the time of fighting might be on us, and therefore we have to be ready to fight. And in the 1950s, the Greek Cyprus organized a military organization, which tried to unite, or at least to force the British administration to negotiate with the Greek Cypriots for the transfer of sovereignty of Cyprus to Greece, whereas the Turkish Cypriots organized their own groups to try. First, the original position was that Cyprus should go back to Turkey, and later it was changed to the partitioning the island between Greece and Turkey. So take any period in history since the end of the 19th century, and the Cyprus problem, what could be seen to be a problem with regard to which the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots, or at least those among them who were able to think politically, took opposing views. But not the Greek Cypriots, nor the Turkish Cypriots, were able to adopt a point of view which embraced the other community. It isn't as the Greek Cypriots saw Cyprus as a country. More, it was a matter of Greek Cypriots seeing, at least in the olden days, Cyprus as belonging somehow to the Greek or the Hellenic world, and therefore it would have to become part of the Greek state in order to gain its national salvation. The Turkish Cypriots, again, of course, did not identify themselves with the Greek Cypriots. They took a line, which perhaps was imposed or inspired by their leaders and the government of Turkey, according to which a certain part of the island would have to be given to Turkey. When Cyprus became an independent country, an independent state in 1960, not enough Greek Cypriots and not enough Turkish Cypriots believed in the permanence, it seems, of the independent state of Cyprus, and there weren't enough to be willing to work to make the arrangement succeed. Now, obviously I cannot take the story to 1991, for that wasn't my intention. I was trying to say, to make the point that it seems that the Cyprus problem imposed itself upon the face and soul of Cyprus and created generations of Greek and Turkish Cypriots who became increasingly hostile one to the other. So much so that I want to say that the Cyprus problem created the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities. It made them, from one generation to the next, hostile and opposing in their points of view. It seems then that those people who are doing all the running and were exercising all the influence in Cyprus were those people who, from the Greek side point of view, Greek Cypriot side, they were not able either to communicate or accommodate the Turkish Cypriot point of view. In the case of the Turkish Cypriots, they were not able to accommodate the Greek Cypriot point of view. Now, it's only in the last I suppose, few years, or perhaps after the invasion of 1974, that small groups of Greek and Turkish Cypriots were able to assert and claim a certain view for Cyprus, which saw Cyprus for the first time as a country. And I think that this is a point of view that we've got to examine. Because if the Greek and Turkish Cypriots are able to achieve peace among themselves and stop squandering their energies, their minds, their souls, and their resources in trying to undermine each other's objectives, then they've got to find something, some point of view which is common to them. And this must surely be the idea that Cyprus is one of the countries in the world, and if they don't achieve peace, then Cyprus will be a bad country. I'm putting it in a childish way in order to strike home the point that what the Cyprus problem, or one of the reasons, or partial answer to the question whom the Cyprus problem matters to, is that it matters to Cypriots, how shall I put it, whether they think about it or they didn't think about it, whether they feel concerned or even whether they have got indifferent and left it all to their leaders. Because when your country is destroyed as a country, when the institutions under which you live have a hostile or even a militaristic character, and they always try to strike at hostile forces which are themselves Cypriot forces, it means that you cannot identify with your country anymore. So the Cyprus problem matters to Cypriots because it matters to, it affects the orientation, the energies, the way the talents and abilities of the Cypriots are being used. And I think it matters, I could say, to other countries which are members of the same family as that to which Cyprus belongs. It matters, I believe, to Europe and the world. I'm not saying that somebody in Britain will lose his job or somebody will lose his seat in the House of Parliament, House of Commons, if something happens in Cyprus. But I think that you've got to be concerned about your neighbor, not just your next door neighbor, but the person who lives down the road. And if you can, if people in Britain, in France, in Germany, can see themselves, as many do see themselves, as members of a European family, it seems to me that they've got to ask themselves whether it's right that any member of the family, of the brotherhood, should be divided, should have hostile forces in it, should be militarized, should be reduced in that way. I think I'm quoting President Kennedy when he said that unfreedom anywhere in the United States reduces us all. And I would say that unfreedom in Cyprus reduces Europe. Now, I am not asking you to accept the Greek Cypriot approach to the question of how the Cyprus problem should be solved. Just examine the facts, just examine the position of each side, and you take your position as to how perhaps the problem should be approached and solved. But as I'm suggesting that the problem, although it's very long-standing, although it's intractable, some people might say, more intractable problems have been solved by people of goodwill, people of intelligence, and people with a vision. Obviously, the sort of people who exist now in Cyprus, in each of the two communities, who are the intellectual heirs of those people who ran the country, or the two communities in the past, the bigots, the fools, those who dislike the other community, cannot solve the problems. Those people who can talk rationally about a solution to Cyprus problem must be people who, first of all, can talk to the other community. And there is a small, I hope it's an increasing number of Greek and Turkish Cypriots who are prepared to talk about this on the basis that Cyprus must be an independent country, to be cherished, to be protected, and the rights of the people of which should be re-established. So we are going to hear today a number of papers, each dealing with different aspects to the Cyprus problem. I hope that our orientation and interest would be on what to do towards solving the Cyprus problem. I'm not saying that we are going to solve it here, but if some people don't start talking about solving the Cyprus problem and how it might be solved in a way which is intelligible to both communities, because it reflects a point of view of sufficient numbers of Greek and Turkish Cypriots, then of course Cyprus will remain a free and divided country, and therefore to that extent Europe will remain unfree and divided. It seems that there hasn't been enough talk, not only between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, but of course between Greeks and Turks, who teach each other's children to dislike and to hate and to regard the other nation as being their enemies. So it seems to me that any effort to think rationally about the Cyprus problem and find a rational and fair settlement must, if at all possible, proceed in a way which is parallel to efforts to solve or improve the situation in Greco-Turkish relations. Again, there are a few people in both Greece and Turkey who want to see improvement in relations. Now, they are still perhaps a small minority. They are cowed because traditionally the nationalists did all the running. Perhaps I think that I'm quoting General, who was the founder of the Salvation Army? Booth. That's right, who said, why should the devil have the best tunes? It seems that the bigots and the nationalists have had the best slogans for so long, and it seems to me that it's time for those people who believe that Cyprus could be thought about and its problems discussed as a country to be, that needs to take its place among civilized European states and be allowed to make its own contribution to European civilization. Those people must take the initiative and try to create the circumstances in which the two communities, and if possible the two nations, Greece and Turkey, could talk about, and through talking about the problems, create a rational picture, identify the various problems as they are, and see how they affect the rights of each of the two communities in Cyprus, the nations, and try to solve them. International law, human rights, I mean, these are standards which carry the authority of world opinion. But I certainly don't think that the Cyprus problem is a matter for the rights of one of the two communities or the other. And very often, we have to balance the right of one community, the rights of the other community, against the rights of the other community, as in ordinary domestic situations. You may have, for example, to balance the rights of Kent farmers to the rights of perhaps all the good of the community, where it decides that it needs a motorway to link up London to the Channel Tunnel. I mean, there are sometimes cases, for example, when the good of the community might require the sacrifice of certain rights of individuals. Now, I'm not necessarily a supporter, certainly not an admirer of President Vassiliou in Cyprus, but ever since he came to power, I think many people believed, not just Greek Cypriots, but quite a number of Turkish Cypriots, that he himself would be prepared to consider the rights of the Turkish Cypriots and work towards a settlement in Cyprus which will restore the sovereignty and unity of Cyprus on the basis of a compromise. And I think that's very hopeful because, very hopeful development because Vassiliou now is gaining friends. But I don't think that those friends that Vassiliou is gaining should be the enemies of Turkey. Because I think Turkey is itself a European state. Turkey itself is part of the European family. And therefore I hope that with the solution of the Cyprus problem, Turkey will gain its rightful place within the European family. Thank you very much. chairman has gone somewhere, but I better introduce the next chairman because Dr. David Bell will introduce the speakers. Now, Dr. Rodney Wilson and Mr. George